Welcome to the Season 5 of the India Energy Hour podcast. This podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. Your hosts for this episode are Shreya J., Delhi-based energy and climate journalist, and Dr. Sandeep Pai, Washington-based energy transition researcher and author. The show is produced by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from rural India. If you like our podcast, please rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the platform where you listen to our podcast. Your support will help us reach a larger audience. As India transitions toward a low-carbon future, the private sector's role in embracing sustainability and ESG is paramount. While top corporations lead with ambitious net-zero goals, many small and mid-sized firms are yet to begin their sustainability and ESG journey, held back by data challenges, lack of awareness, and complex disclosure frameworks. To understand how Indian companies can embrace sustainability and ESG, we spoke with Ms. Prarthana Borah, Vice President, Momentum. With decades of experience across environmental education and corporate sustainability, she offers valuable insights on simplifying ESG frameworks, building internal capacity, and unlocking the potential of India's private sector in the net zero transition.
Prarthana, welcome to the India Energy Hour. I've been meaning to have you both because I've admired your work over the years, but also sort of like in my own understanding, I really want to understand how companies, private sector, and otherwise are thinking about sustainability and how hard or easy it is for them to actually embrace sustainability in a true sense. So we'll have a lot to talk about on those topics, but before we dive into the topic of today, I want to start with your own personal journey. Where are you from? What did you study? How did you get into this space? I mean, these days it's easy to get into this space. There's so many courses, there's so many pathways, but I assume a few decades ago it was like climate, energy, sustainability, or even environment was not a space that kids would just get into. So how did you get here, and from wherever you started?
Thank you, Sandeep. I've also been an admirer of your work and the India Energy Hour, so I'm really very happy to be invited. I was waiting when will I be invited, so that's a start. Um, so interestingly, my environmental journey was a very conscious choice, and environment was a conscious career choice. I grew up in Shillong in Meghalaya, and obviously, those days we didn't have Netflix and technology, so our fun time was a walk in the forest or a picnic in the forest. So I grew up surrounded by butterflies and caterpillars and forests, and so typically, that was the world I knew. And at the time, there was a lot of felling of trees because of the need for agricultural land, and the slash and burn technique is a very accepted kind of a technique in the Northeast. So I used to be very conscious, as a 19-year-old, thinking about what's going to happen to my forests and stuff like that. But of course, I didn't know how to transition that into a career. We didn't really have a lot of eco camps and volunteer networks. But interestingly, at that time, I got a project to, somebody gave me a project to work on where they wanted to explore the need for environmental education in schools. So I did some interviews in some of the local schools, and then, and discovered that, the consciousness as far as environment is there. Like everyone wants to be in the forest, but when it comes to, whether we need to protect the forest or do you think about the future of the forest, nobody was thinking about it. So I became very determined that I wanted a career in environment. I studied economics. So obviously the natural transition was environmental economics. But obviously at that time, where I studied, there were no courses. So I was like looking around for something. And as luck would have it, I was selected for this fellowship program at the Center for Environment Education. So CE Ahmedabad ran a fellowship program. Oh, it's like a nine month program, which and it was called Training on Environmental Education. So it looked like the ideal program, because it was about understanding environment, but very practical version, and leading to a career, like a job. So I got selected and I moved to Gujarat in 1995 to start my environmental journey, and of course never looked back. My first job was as a conservation educator in a nature park. So I kind of designed nature camps and and nature trails and things like that. And the years after that, mostly it was in environmental education, in the sense that I taught sustainability. I worked in a design. I worked at the National Institute of Design to understand design and sustainability. But my transition to climate was in 2000, in year 2000, when I went back to the Center for Environment Education to work, and I joined to lead a project which was actually the first climate change education program in schools, and it was called the Paryavan Mitra program, and it ran in 200,000 schools, and was a collaboration with the UNEP. So that's how that was the beginning of my work in climate change. I worked in climate and, of course, related areas like biodiversity for over 12 years in different regions. I worked in Gujarat, I worked in the Northeast, and then I moved to Delhi. My final project, I call it my career high, was actually to develop the background papers for COP21 in Paris for the government of India, which led to the development of a publication called Parampara, which looked at climate friendly, sustainable practices of India, and was launched by the Prime Minister at COP. So after that, I was wondering, you get edgy, you want to move on because you've done a lot of projects, and it so happened that I was in Delhi at that time, and I got the opportunity to work on air pollution, and I joined Clean Air Asia as the country head. Very, very interesting journey where I looked at the entire policy support for the National Clean Air Program, development of air quality indicators for the Climate Smart Cities framework, and also a couple of clean air action plans. So that was a very, very policy oriented kind of a role where you supported policy in terms of city clean air plans and other clean air initiatives. Of course, I continued to work on the education communication part, set up an youth clean air network, worked with children in schools in terms of looking at air quality monitoring around play areas, and interesting projects like that. Right around that time, actually, I got very interested in the private sector, primarily because I realized that while the private sector's focus was very much there on the CSR side as far as environment was concerned, but the ESG was just being discussed at that time. It wasn't what it is today. And I wanted to work in terms of engaging the private sector more in terms of how they could contribute to some of these programs rather than on ESG. And it so happened that I got an opportunity with CDP, because CDP was looking at an Asia focus and looking at increasing disclosures. So I joined CDP as the country director of CDP India. And this was the time when they were looking at increasing disclosures in the country. So my primary role was actually to push the CDP climate disclosures. But I also set up the Science Based Targets Incubator, which is and basically have had almost about 70 Indian companies signed up to it to set science-based targets. The other area that I pushed for was also the sustainable finance area. So CDP India developed the input paper for the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. So my work with the private sector is about 7-8 years old. I have been focusing on reporting, looking at internal strategies, looking at how you could support supply chain. A lot of my work is focused on training and making complex subjects simpler. And it actually comes from my background because, I've always been an educator. So if you look at the diverse areas, I'm not a theoretical expert in anything, but if you ask me to talk in terms of training, capacity building, and communications, I think I would look at that as the thread that builds all the different parts of my stints in different jobs. So in the recent past, I have been doing very interesting work, mostly in terms of facilitating, the emission reduction journeys of companies which do not fall in the top 100 or 200, because if you look at the private sector, when we talk about the private sector, we always talk about the big names, and we kind of put that because it's always defined by a market cap, right? And but then there is the other private sector, which may not be relevant from a market cap perspective, but they also they contribute to emissions, right? Maybe more, and we don't have enough data. So what I've been doing is that looking at this kind of a segment, and how do we help these industries to transition in terms of decarbonization, in terms of their ESG strategies, uh, water risks, how do they address water risks, and multiple areas, even training of supply chains, which includes maybe the supply chain of a sector like sugar, where you have farmers. So that's the kind of work I've been doing, and that's in short the story of my environmental career.
That's not a short story. That's a long story, which is great. I mean, I just have one follow up question. It's very interesting because it's like so many decades of, you can't really summarize in 8-10 minutes your decade long journey. But as you were saying that you define yourself as environmental or educator, um, like what does that mean, because I'm just trying to understand what would it mean, because it'll be interesting to understand how you define it and what your day to day would look like as an educator, environmental educator. So if you want to explain that a bit.
So Sandeep, it's as I said, it's about making things easier. And I'd like to use a simple example of, what I mean when I say environmental education. So we were at a training program where we were training a couple of MSMEs on reducing industry emissions. So we were supposed to, kind of do their carbon footprint report, and my colleague was giving a presentation on how to do the assessment. And one of the participants stood up and said, "But you've been talking about this CO2. What is CO2?" So sometimes I think we do not, anticipate these kind of questions because we've been in the sector for a long time. So when I say I'm an environmental educator, I think I like to communicate complex language in a terminology that is understood, which also means adapting it in local context. It's not about just the language, but it's also about adapting it in the local context. So when we talk about, say, let's take the case of a private sector. You have a complex disclosure framework like a CDP supply chain disclosure framework, which basically encourages private sector companies to disclose on their supply chain. Now, the ideal the ideal grade would for the best disclosure would be an A plus, and that would come if your supply chain disclosures. But what happens is that many of the Indian companies don't even know their supply chain. So, so instead of discouraging them, or kind of figuring out a way to reduce the grade, how do we make it, how do we encourage them to continue the process? So even if they disclose partially on even if they don't disclose on the entire supply chain, but partially on the supply chain, how do we encourage them in that kind of methodology? And so for someone like me, the objective would be to present the framework in a manner that this is the beginning of your journey. And how do you explain it so that you can encourage the companies to start taking action instead of being worried that we will not be able to do it. And because of that, our grade is going to come down. So that would be probably, the kind of approach I would take as an educator.
Great. So simplifying complex concepts for people who want to learn more or who want to understand the field. I mean, I think it's at the crux of this. A lot of times in my own work, I realize that many people don't know basics, and it's not to their fault. It's just that's not what they do. Uh, Great, wonderful. I have so many questions. You've already given me so many food for thoughts. So let's just get into the topic of today, which is the role of private sector and how they can be more sustainable, and is it like what challenges they face, etc. So before we get into it, I want to understand how you define sustainability, and how does it intersect with ESG issues? I mean, this is something, people throw these terms all the time, but how do you define them? What does it mean for you as a practitioner in the field?
So I think if you look at the kind of community that I work with, or even the space where today ESG is being used, which is mostly in the consulting world, the both the terms are being used interchangeably, so which is not correct basically, because you use sustainability and you use ESG together, or you just use one or the other. So if I have to respond to that question, I think I'll break it up into sustainable development, sustainability, and ESG. So, because if you look at sustainable development, it has an accepted definition, right? And so whenever you listen, or you talk about it, immediately someone comes to the definition of sustainable development, which is meeting the needs of the future by taking care of meeting the needs of the present, meeting the needs of the future by taking care of the present. Um, so, so, but that's actually the journey. If you look at it, we're talking about intergenerational equity, which is the journey. Sustainability is the balance you reach from that journey. So, sustainability actually, if you look at is a very broad framework which looks at the economics, the social, the cultural, and the environmental, and there are ways in which these four elements intersect. ESG becomes more of a framework, because ESG is about how you look at your internal operations, how you look at your internal journeys, how do you look at your internal use of energy, how do you look at your internal emissions. And ESG primarily evolved from an investor's concept. And if you look at it, and even the timelines are different. If you look at it, I think ESG kind of the whole socially responsible investing started around the 1960s, and then it went on to 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 when the UN talked about the 6 ESG principles in 2004. And then of course GRI came in, and then you had all the reporting frameworks that came in. Now, primary difference is that if you look at ESG, is that you have certain indicators in terms of how you want to measure, how you want to approach, how you want to define your internal strategies. There are environmental parameters, there are social parameters, and of course, there are very interestingly governance parameters, because it looks inside. And when you talk about governance parameters, you go into details like, what is your board composition? What is the business ethics? and even what is your supply chain policy. So these are certain areas that when you talk about sustainability in general, you might not do a deep dive into the details, because you're not really measuring a company's strategy or inputs, or um, what do you call it? It's uh, position in terms of sustainability. So I think that's primary difference. But ultimately, if you look at it, both are have a similar kind of a goal, that you obviously want to do good for the planet.
Right. So, I mean, just to kind of understand a bit more of this, is it in a simple, in your own language as an educator, if I have to simplify this, um, a sustainable development would be more of a vision, a mission. Um, the sustainabilities are more principles, and then ESG would become a framework to measure and to monitor. Is that a good way to understand this, or I'm off?
No, absolutely. I think what ESG does is that because we are dealing with a sector that likes numbers and likes actual figures. We are trying to translate the broader concept of sustainability to something which can be measured and gauged, and we try to kind of figure out a methodology for that. And the other is that ESG is, I mean, it's slightly less inclined to just the E. I mean, you do have concepts like diversity, for instance, which comes into it. You have a concept like you have safety, for instance, which you wouldn't ideally bring up when you're talking about sustainability. Like if you look at the SDGs, I mean, we have a gender SDG, right? But I mean, it's not about how many women versus how many men you have in a company. So I think it's more about numbers and how you translate it into operations within an organization.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm now keen to dive into the role of private sector. So before we started recording, we were just having an informal chat, and you really nicely explained that there are top 100 companies, and then there are others who are not top 100, but also have a both a footprint but also a major role in Indian economy. So I'm just wondering if you want to sort of explain how Indian companies, particularly private companies, are approaching sustainability and ESG issues. What are some key trends, and are they any different from global players? I don't know if you're able to make a distinction at this point between the top 100 and the others. But if not, let's just start with a general understanding of how they're approaching, how this field has even evolved in India. Like I don't, I believe that this might have taken some time to catch up these sustainability and ESG trends within the Indian private sector. So yeah, it'll be great to hear from you.
So I think if you're talking about Indian industry, there are different levels in which industry are in. If you look at some of the top industries, and I am happy to quote names like Mahindra and Tata, who probably have larger sustainability teams than any sustainability organization, and are much ahead of the curve in terms of what they are working on, primarily because there's a large investor push, and internal sustainability strategy has become very, very important. So for such companies, it's more a business agenda, because they know that they have to start thinking about climate risks, for instance, and water scarcity, because an investor is going to ask for that data. So I think these top level companies are actually ahead of the curve. They have commitments which are, to go net zero by 2050, 2040, maybe even earlier. But that's not the entire private sector. So it's interesting because the rest of the private sector is driven either by global regulation or by Indian regulation. Now, as far as Indian regulation goes, I think it's only the top 1,000 which have which have the BRSR applicable. But there is now a lot of global push, especially because of European regulation, which is asking for a lot of science-based data when you are involved in a business. So basically, if you're exporting your good to any European country, you would have to disclose, or you would have to kind of show your pathway in terms of a net zero journey. So I think there are different levels. There would be a top first level, which would be doing, even who would be adhering to even the latest disclosure framework, which is now the nature disclosures. They would have science-based targets. They would be disclosing on their supply chain. While as you go to the as you go down to say level 4, they would probably be at the beginning of their ESG journey, where you would need to explain to them what ESG is. So for such companies, the journey starts with estimating scope 1 and scope 2 emissions and preparation of a carbon footprint report, because that's something that they probably will understand. But even within that, the data collection process is a challenge, because it means you have to gather the energy data from various departments and go beyond just the top management. So I think even developing a small carbon footprint report is a journey that is something that we should look at positively, because it's the starting of the journey. What uh, I usually suggest is that you begin the journey with your emissions accounting, and then you develop a basic ESG strategy, which would help you identify your materiality topics, and then help you kind of prepare a pathway. If you look at technical data, CDP reports that it's only in the third year of disclosure that companies actually have emission reduction targets or emission reduction projects. So it actually takes you 3 years before you start thinking of what your energy transition policy would be. How would you look at your emission reduction strategy? So I think it's a journey, and what is important that companies begin that journey and not just look at it from the perspective of pushing it back because it's not a regulatory requirement. And this is probably where the understanding of climate, water, uh, natural resources from the perspective of risk will play a very, very big role. And that's probably the narrative that needs to be pushed, rather than reporting on ESG, or talking about regulatory frameworks. I'm not saying those two are not important, but I just feel that if we push the risk narrative, then companies are bound to look internally. And I just have a quick example on this, and I usually use it in very in basic ESG coachings. Is that if you have a manufacturing plant near a sea, near the sea, and it is liable to flood, so you need to prepare yourself for that kind of a situation. So I think that kind of example sets them thinking, and I always see a lot of nodding in a group of a group of industry personnel who don't usually like to be told that they need to get into us.
Right. This is really interesting. So I just have one question. See, imagine this is a hypothetical, but I can assume that you might have come across this kind of situation. Imagine that there is a company where the board, the CEO, the management haven't thought about any of this, right? Now, how do you motivate them? And even if you can motivate them, like, is it usually that one person drives it, or the board suddenly changes its heart and starts looking at ESG issues? Like, how does it work in practice usually? Like, how do you get companies to take that action, because this is not something that can happen on the side. This is a major sort of undertaking to look at your entire footprint and then come up with policies over a period of time. But yeah, like how do you even start this process?
So I think 70% of the time I fail, I must tell you that. But because, I think we as a country are still, are driven by regulatory push. So I think it's very difficult to actually kind of convince based on your knowledge or what your expectations are. But I think the good part is today that the there is a set of companies who are doing it, and because there is a global push that their supply chains need to transition, not only global, actually, even a national push. If you look at the PRSR, they did say that the top 200 would look at supply chain disclosures. So I think that would probably be the entry point, because even within the national reporting framework, there is there is a component which says that your supply chain needs to be trained. So within that training component, if we add sustainability norms, and we add sustainability issues like what I just mentioned to you, the example of having a manufacturing plant near a liable to flood area. I think that kind of an example sometimes have, say, you can translate at least in a room of 30, at least three people would come back to you and say that we'd like to start this journey. So it would be, probably we would have to look at low hanging fruits, like where we can address certain companies who are already advanced. Like in the auto sector, we see that a lot, because the top companies globally have their supply chain in the country. So you can actually look into that supply chain and start with that kind of sector. So, in terms of convincing, I think there are multiple ways of doing it. One is that, as you said, there are the first movers who would probably be interested in going very deep in their supply chain. So they will go into tier three, for instance, and then that becomes like a clientele for you, because you can start the basics with them. The other would be leadership, in the sense that there are, leaders who want to be prepared. The third is anticipating global regulation, because I think the global regulation today, even in a vendor requirement form, they are asking for, say, emissions data, or if you have thought about target setting. So if we can identify these kind of companies, I think that would be another way of doing it. But I think the policy push around sustainability is still missing, especially for the private sector, because I don't really see, say, for instance, the Ministry of Industries talking about, how to, decarbonize. Maybe one sector which has now a decarbonization pathway for the country is the steel sector. So if more and more, ministries take up this this like I seriously feel that maybe the Ministry of MSMEs would be one sector which definitely needs to start thinking about of it. So those are some of the pushes that you miss, because if you have that kind of a regulatory push, it becomes easier to get an audience. But right now I think it's more driven by global regulations and identifying where the entry points are, as well as looking at first movers, and as you said, leadership, who are would be interested in this kind of an approach.
Yeah, and the risk of not doing this is, for example, again, we were discussing about CBAM. If you can sort of double click on that point about like what the risk is, if Indian companies were not to do any of this, what is their overarching risk that you see?
So the CBAM is applicable to some products which is specified, and it basically is a process where you need to kind of calculate the embedded emissions of your product, and kind of declare it. So what happens is ultimately you would be competing in a global market, because if you're exporting a product to a global market, then you'd be also you would be competing with other suppliers. So what happens is that if there is a supplier who has a better sustainability index, or has a better kind of has a lower emissions, his product has a lower emissions, then obviously you would lose out in the business. So I think the larger implication would be that. But I think what is more important, Sandeep, is that the whole issue of the risk attached to your business, I think that is what needs to be really taken into consideration. Because even if you look at the top, say it's top 200 companies in India, um, the 2022 CDP report, estimated that almost 2,800 billion Indian INR was the estimated climate risk from these 220 companies. These are the top companies, right? So this is only disclosed data, right? And if you look at what goes beyond, then it's definitely there would be much more. And the risk that was voted as highest is the acute physical risk, which means that the immediate impact or extreme weather impact. Now that is something that I think everyone should be prepared for. Why only the 220 companies, right? So the narrative around that becomes very, very important, and which is why risk assessment becomes very important. And unless I think the risk assessment, the climate risk assessment, and not just climate, even water, all this transition to the supply chain and to other companies, it will be very difficult to estimate what is the total risk. So that's one area that probably needs a lot of work. But the other interesting aspect is that there is also the opportunity element, and now a lot of larger companies are looking at climate as an opportunity, which the traditional environmentalist in me would say no. But I think if you look at the good side of it, um, again I'll quote CDP because I know that report very well. So 2022 report of the 220 companies estimated almost 30,000 billion INR as the climate opportunities. And these opportunities were in product development, in energy transition, in financial products. So you see, there is a natural transition there. Like you look at energy transition as an opportunity because you look at energy efficiency, you look at reduction of cost. So I think that is another narrative that is something that companies, if they understand, they go into it. So I think the risk and the opportunity narrative needs to be pushed further. We need to do a little bit more of, there isn't enough, say, local research in the area. So you are often talking about, data of the top 200 companies, or you're talking about, what is the, the research output of global companies. So I think that those are some gaps that we still have as a country, because we do not have enough information out there in terms of primary level data that is collected from industries which are susceptible to climate risks or water risks.
So that leads me to my another interesting question that I have in my mind, which is like how easy or difficult it is to collect this data, both for companies. I mean, I can imagine a company which has so many layers of suppliers, which has so many layers of operations, like how easy it is for them to even like collect this data, and how easy it is for people like us and you to then get them to disclose that data, right? So how difficult is it to go and actually see what's there, like to bring this transparency?
So, fortunately, today there is technology and AI which kind of supports this, data collection process. And I think, there are a lot of good platforms that enable this process. But I think disclosure frameworks are very complex. And, if you look at a framework like a CDP or a EcoVadis, which is the disclosure framework on supply chain, they have you have like CDP has like over 60 questions, and each question would have multiple questions. So I think the issue is that the frameworks, when you're reporting on a framework, it's very complex, and it does need to be translated to simplified versions, which is where we need the expertise in terms of technical expertise. Because what is happening is today these technology platforms are being created by technologists, and they do not necessarily understand how to break up the data and simplify it. For instance, emissions data is about understanding the energy use, even going down to a very minute level. So you would have to have a an explanatory note that could explain to someone from the HR department or the procurement department why you need the data, right? Because, for the person, even to look up bills and, kind of uh, give you that information is a very tedious process. So to your question on how difficult is it to get the data, as I said, the mature industries have now developed a process where they can, they have a feedback mechanism. Their departments are educated enough so they can automatically feed this data into a system. But there the problem is more in terms of validation. So someone would need to check and validate the data, because sometimes you might just go wrong with, say, a unit. We've had that problem, whenever we've looked at data. I mean, just a change of unit or an extra zero can, kind of change the entire report. So I think, there are two ways of looking at this as as a challenge. One is that there are the companies who are mature in terms of the data collection. They have great platforms. They have gone through a process and they've been doing it for many years, but then they still need validation. But then there is the other set of companies where the understanding of this data, if like just the question of how many women are there in your like in ESG. There's a very simple uh, question which talks about the gender balance in your different departments, or in your plants, and then you need to get the data from the HR department. Now that's probably easy one, but then when you have to go and track something like, okay, what is the energy use, or in your various manufacturing plants or your units, that is where the complication comes. Because if you have large industry, it becomes hundreds of plants. So then it becomes a little bit complicated, and it's not very very easy to do it manually, because you have to get into so much detail. It's very resource intensive, physically very draining. So data collection is difficult, but there are ways in which companies have managed to kind of look at ways to kind of make it simpler. And today I think the use of AI has facilitated that process, because you can also do some modeling and you can do some derivations. So those are areas that are being explored.
Right. So I mean, it's such a complex process just to even hear. I can only imagine people who work on it. I mean, first the company has to sort of come up with all the data. Somebody has to validate. Then, if they want to be part of any framework, then they have to input that data in that framework, reconcile, and if if the data collection has any issues, then it percolates all the way, you know, to reporting and so on. So I mean, like, do we have enough people who can do that within companies and outside? Like, do we need to train more professionals uh, to work on ESG issues? So we have a battery of army. Because I was just thinking that as more companies in India are move towards sustainability and ESG issues and become serious, like, do we have enough staff? Do we have enough colleges and people to be trained in these areas?
I think we have a lot of courses and programs that are I mean, are there in the country and globally. I mean, there are a lot of online certifications which teach you, about frameworks and about data generation, but the actual process of data generation, I don't think we get enough. We don't have enough trained people, so even companies need to give that kind of time to train people to bring them up to a particular level. So in my experience, it takes about a year for someone to actually understand one framework. And I don't think anyone can become an expert on all frameworks. And my suggestion to the teams that I've built is that you need to really go deep into one and become an expert in that, instead of moving on. um, because the other reason is that because these kind of frameworks are always evolving, so you need to also be up to date in terms of what is happening in the space. Because we are talking about the natural world, and the natural world is constantly changing, so every time a new kind of um, calculation or a new kind of methodology appears, so you have to be constantly conscious and read. um, I have to emphasize the word read, because I think even now I have to read, and I get very nervous when I have to think of when I have to kind of talk to a client on a particular issue, because sectorally the application might be different, because the tools and frameworks and methodologies have sectoral differences. So to your question on whether we have enough people, I don't think we have enough people. But I don't think just training external people to support the process is the way forward. I think it has to be imbibed within the organization, and the ideal way would be to build internal teams. The successful sustainability experiences or sustainability models are within companies who have actually invested in building internal sustainability teams. Um, you will always need an expert to guide you, but I think everyone should really, companies, even if it's one person, I think the ideal way would be to have someone doing it. One of the biggest challenges we face in terms of Indian companies is that because the BRSR is an Indian regulation and goes into the annual report, it's the finance department that deals with it. And it's often very, very difficult to convince, in terms of what is the next steps. So I just feel that it would be so much easier if you have sustainability as a department, or, someone who understands sustainability, which is why probably some of the global frameworks actually also ask for data on governance, so that they can understand how many people in the senior leadership are actually trained to understand sustainability. So I think the ideal way would be to imbibe sustainability, and when I say that you need a sustainability department, I don't mean that the department has to be separate department. It just needs to be something that is integrated within the various other departments. It can also be that model. Um, every company has a different kind of need, so it would obviously vary, but definitely I think the capacity building space is the weakest in the country, and we do need technical knowledge.
Right. I'm just, because we are talking about so many frameworks, and not everybody who's listened to this podcast may be aware about these issues. So I'm just curious, how many frameworks are out there, like within India, and like what's a ballpark number, and how do they vary? Like, are they very different from each other, or like there is some slight variation?
So someone asked me that question when I was recently on another panel, so I know that answer. I think there are over 600 frameworks globally. So it's about choosing what is right for you. The some of them, it depends on why you are disclosing. So there are regulatory frameworks. So obviously, when I say 600, there would be country specific frameworks. So obviously, you have something like the BRSR, which is only relevant for India. Similarly, there would be local frameworks in Singapore, in Hong Kong, or in other countries globally. But that is because there's a regulatory push and you need to do the disclosures. But I think the the history of disclosures was because of the investor push. And I think that's where a framework like CDP becomes very important, because the CDP disclosure framework is used by the data is used by over 700 investors globally, including all the big names. And investors actually look at that data to, before they put their money into companies. So there is the investor push, kind of frameworks. And then there is, of course, the ratings framework, which again add to your value in terms of investors or your supply chain. So there are frameworks like the EcoVadis, which is basically a disclosure on the supply chain, and it gives you a rating so that it positions you separately. The GRI is the most accepted framework because it is the oldest, and it is also it's an ESG framework, like something like a CDP is a climate disclosure framework, and they have separate environmental parameters. So the GRI is the oldest, and the GRI is the most accepted globally. Most of the companies who are starting their ESG journey actually start on with the GRI framework, because it is slightly simpler and relevant, and applicable, locally to multi-country. And then, of course, there are very specific rating agencies which also have their own frameworks, which kind of gives you positioning. So it depends on actually, it depends on what your objective is before you start disclosing. And this is what usually is our recommendation, because ultimately it's about looking at internal strategy when you and your journey in terms of reducing emissions and your net zero transition should be an internal process more than the related frameworks. But having a framework basically helps because data gives you a different perspective. It gives you numbers, right? So if you have the numbers, you're able to gauge, you're able to also model for the future. So I think the reason that frameworks are popular is because of the number that comes in, and it becomes easier for private sector organizations which are actually focused on financial numbers to also have a number associated with sustainability.
I think we've talked a lot. Almost we're at 50 minutes. You won't realize,
Yeah,
but
really.
I would love to hear some examples. Of what, like what, how. I mean, I know it's hard to describe like a good example or something, but if there are some interesting examples of companies that have really push the boundaries of sustainability within India, especially because I know you're a storyteller. So if there are some you may or may not name the company, but if there are examples of how a company changed course and got into sustainability issues and then got into reporting and how they have won accolades. I mean, I would be just curious to understand through an example if it's available readily with you.
So I think, there are definitely good companies, because obviously, they look at their internal journey, and they're also well known, because they have taken initiatives. But I think we also have to understand that these are companies that have started their sustainability journey like a long time back. I think, it didn't happen overnight. So, so there is definitely, there are companies which have begun their journey. But I think what really excites me is when a company is able to address issues uh, beyond the operations. I think that is where things become difficult, and that is probably where you one needs handholding, because it's not about just reducing the impact in your own boundary. So I, uh, you know, um, I've had some very interesting experiences working with companies, especially when it comes to working on the supply chain. And it's very interesting because you would assume that they would know their supply chain, but most companies, even if they are very large companies and doing very well in their sustainability journey, often do not have a ready list of their suppliers. And even if they do, then they have no way to contact them, because there are so many loops around that. So there are a couple of companies who are actually working on the supply chain to a much lower level. And I'm actually we are just doing it we are actually doing a very interesting assessment of a supply chain in this context. And the company's actually gone into the detail of looking at whether their financial uh, output has increased or decreased because they have changed their suppliers. And interestingly, it also emerges that the more you work on your supply chain, that because you also transition your energy efficient measures from your internal operations to the supply chain by hand holding, by technology transfer, by trainings, you also manage to improve your financial output. So I think there are examples like that which really become like a benchmark, because ultimately that's where you want to reach, right? You want to go beyond the boundaries. But um but I also think that there are a lot of companies which are looking at which are beginning their sustainability journey, and it's a really difficult step to take for, say, a small industry which is more focused on profits and on actually sustaining the business, and to actually start the journey and start estimating emissions. So I would like to say that there are different levels, but it would be very important for companies to start estimating emissions, because we do. I mean, we have global data that says that India is one of the highest emitting economies, but if you look at it, I don't know how much of the emissions we've really captured. So, because if you look at the data that is available, and because I'm working in the sector, you also have the numbers, right, in terms of how many companies are actually disclosing or how much public data is there. So, I think for a country like ours, it's very important to actually start estimating emissions, because if we don't, we wouldn't know the extent of work that is required. And and I believe that that's where data plays a role, because once you start estimating, then you also realize what you have to do, because I think that is more important, because that's what is going to lead to this climate action journey.
Great. This is fantastic. I was actually thinking about like the way you were describing, and throughout this 1 hour of discussion, like how much of the data is actually out there. So do we,
Yeah.
what we report, what we hear, how much of it is true? Is it in like 20% range, 50 percentile, 60 percentile? So curious. But before we end, I have to ask you one question, which is like, you really nicely explained how things have evolved in the ESG space. There were some companies that started really early, others are coming in, etc. What is your wish list for the next, let's say, 5 years? If you were to record a conversation again in 5 years, like what would you like to see this field? How would you like to see this field grow? What changes would you like? I'm asking a big picture question. Like how do you want sort of like the whole ESG space and its adoption see in India with respect to private companies?
I think the weakest spot we have as far as India is concerned is the research and the science based tools to actually facilitate the transition journeys. We have a lot of global tools, global frameworks. Um, the BRSR is an attempt to kind of collect data, but no one's really using that data or creating a narrative around this. And having worked both nationally and globally, I just feel at a loss sometimes when a company comes to me and asks, "Hame kya karna chahiye?" Because it's very difficult to translate what is in the theoretical framework to a practical framework. So my wish list, honestly, and I've told this in many forums, is that how do we look at Indian adaptations of some of the great tools like the SBTI, or some of the work that CDP does. I'm not saying that we want to have a different one, but how do we adapt it to in the Indian context, and make it available and simplified so that uh, the 25 lakh MSMEs start, kind of accounting their emissions. Because if you look at that, that's a huge number, but do we have data on the emissions? So I think my wish list would be really to have more research. I think we have a lot of courses and we have a lot of people who are going out in the market, but we do not have enough research or science-based tools as far as climate science and translating it to the India transition journey is concerned. Because ultimately, politically, we might announce a long-term target, but we all know that we can't wait, so we do need to present alternative trajectories. And there are a lot of people who want to do it. There are companies who are committing to 2040, who are committing to 2050. So why not give them the right kind of tools that they can, that are science based? And there are a lot of tools, but there's nothing like, say, and the SBTI. How does the SBTI become more applicable in the Indian context is something that probably I would really be interested in seeing in the next few years.
Well, Pratna, thank you so much for your time. You took 1 hour and really explained this whole field to me. I mean, I'm very new to this whole ESG space, and I really appreciate all the insights, all the examples, and thank you for all the work you do in this space. It's so important, yet so difficult to sometimes understand what's going on, given that there are 6,000 frameworks and so much more else. So thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sandeep. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_J and at Sandeep Pai.